They say houses keep memories, but some houses keep something else. Before the sun rose over San Diego on that quiet morning in 2011, the Spreckles mansion stood in a silence that didn't feel natural. A silence that felt arranged. Inside those walls, lights were off that should have been on, and rooms were untouched in ways that didn't match the night that supposedly happened there. And outside, something waited in the courtyard, something that would shift an entire investigation in minutes. People would later say the scene made sense, with the explanation written on the final page of the report. But anyone who saw the photos knew instantly. Nothing about this looked ordinary. The position, the ropes, the angles, the details that refused to align with any simple conclusion. From the balcony to the guest room, from the hallway to the courtyard, every part of that mansion felt like a piece of a puzzle that someone had forced into place. Too clean, too controlled, too quiet. And the silence of that night, a silence with no noise, no movement, no signs of life, would become the loudest contradiction of all. This isn't just a strange case. It's a case where the scene and the file tell two different stories. And once you see how wide that gap truly is, you won't be able to unsee it. You're watching Secret Stories.
The morning she was found, the sun hadn't fully risen yet. Inside the Spreckles mansion, everything was silent, except for one man's voice calling her name. When he stepped into the courtyard, he froze. There she was, a scene so strange, so layered, so completely out of place, that even seasoned investigators later admitted they had never seen anything like it. The way her body was positioned, the way the ropes were arranged, the details around her, none of it followed any familiar pattern. And yet, within hours, before tests, before interviews, before anyone could process what they were looking at, a conclusion was already forming behind closed doors. This was the moment people still talk about today. The moment where the scene itself seemed to scream for answers, but the response it received was silence. If you're already feeling that something is wrong here, take a second and follow this story all the way. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. When the first officers arrived, they stopped the moment they stepped through the gate. The courtyard was quiet, the morning air still cold, and the scene in front of them felt unreal. She was suspended near the balcony, as if the entire setup had been staged by someone who didn't understand how real life works. The positioning of her hands, the way the ropes looped around her body, the marks on the ground below, every detail pointed in a direction no one wanted to say out loud. One officer later admitted that the scene looked built, almost arranged like someone had tried to create a narrative instead of leaving an honest trace of what happened. Another pointed out the footprints, or rather, the lack of them. There should have been movement in the dirt, drag marks, something that connected the balcony to the ground. But the earth was almost undisturbed, as if the scene had been placed there without the usual chaos that comes with real emergencies. Inside the mansion, the silence was heavy. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no noise during the night reported by neighbors. Just a quiet room, an untouched hallway, and a courtyard hiding a scene that made no sense. And yet, even with all these contradictions staring at them, the atmosphere among the officials wasn't urgent. It wasn't tense. It was strangely calm, as if some conclusion had arrived before they did. Inside the mansion, investigators moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if the walls themselves were holding a story no one wanted to hear. The house was immaculate, too immaculate. Expensive furniture perfectly aligned, personal items untouched, not a single object out of place. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom that someone had carefully polished a few hours earlier. But the strangest detail wasn't what they saw. It was what they didn't see. There were no signs of panic, no evidence of a rushed moment, No indications that anyone inside the house had reacted to anything unusual during the night. Her phone was untouched. A small table near the staircase held items so delicately arranged that even a minor disturbance would have shifted them. But everything was exactly where it belonged. One officer noted the quietness of the hallways. Another mentioned how the bedding in the main room looked perfectly smoothed out, as if no one had slept there recently. The whole place felt frozen, like time inside the mansion had stopped long before the morning began. And yet, while the interior whispered calm, the courtyard outside was screaming for attention. Two different worlds in the same property, one too controlled, the other too chaotic. And bridging those worlds should have been clear traces, clues, movements. But there were none. Nothing linked the inside to what happened outside. Nothing. The man who found her later said he had woken up unusually early. He walked through the mansion expecting another quiet morning and headed toward the balcony. But when he opened the door, he didn't step forward. He stepped back. His voice shook when he called for help, but the echo inside the house answered louder than any person could. He told investigators he had tried to approach the courtyard but froze halfway down the stairs. Something about the scene felt wrong, not just visually but physically, as if the entire atmosphere of the property had shifted overnight. His account was brief, almost rehearsed, and it raised questions the officers didn't seem interested in asking. Neighbors later said they didn't hear anything unusual during the night. No shouting, no movement, no signs of urgency, just silence. A silence that now felt suspicious. And then came the first inconsistency. The man claimed he cut the ropes before calling for help, but the timeline didn't match the state of the scene. Some knots looked untouched, others seemed tightened after the fact, and the tool he said he used wasn't where he claimed it was. A small detail, yes, but in cases like this, small details decide everything. When the officers asked him to repeat the sequence of events, he changed the order slightly. Not much, just enough to raise eyebrows. If anyone had been paying attention, the first minutes of this case were supposed to clarify what happened. Instead, they blurred everything. Inside the guest room, investigators noticed something that immediately pulled their attention. A long piece of rope tied to one of the bed frames. It was the kind of detail that should have been the start of a technical analysis, but instead, it felt like a clue that no one wanted to touch. The rope led toward the balcony door, almost forming a path. But the strange part wasn't the rope itself. It was the knot. It was tight, clean, and placed at an angle that looked far too deliberate. When one of the officers leaned down to check the fibers, he frowned. It didn't look like something done in panic or desperation. It looked planned. And then came the notebook. A small notebook sat on the dresser, open to a page with a sentence written in large letters. Investigators would later describe the handwriting as unusual, but they didn't expand on what exactly felt off about it. The message didn't match her typical way of writing, according to people close to her. It also didn't match her tone, her vocabulary, or even the spacing she normally used. But the notebook was photographed, closed, and placed aside. Just like that, another officer pointed out something else. The balcony door showed no signs of struggle, no marks, no damage, and the lock mechanism worked perfectly. Everything suggested careful handling, not a chaotic moment. Even the dust on the lower part of the door frame was undisturbed. Small details. But small details shaped the truth. And in this room, every detail contradicted the next, like pieces from different puzzles forced together. The balcony itself became the next focus. It overlooked the courtyard, with a drop that made the officers tread carefully near the edge. But what caught their attention wasn't the height. It was the railing. The paint was old enough to chip under pressure, yet it showed no fresh marks, no scratches, no signs of someone climbing over or leaning heavily against it. If she had crossed that railing in a moment of panic, there should have been impact on the paint, fingerprints on the top edge, smudging, anything, but the surface was untouched, as smooth as it had been the day before. Then came the discovery that puzzled everyone. The balcony floor had dust patterns that didn't match the story the officials were leaning toward. A distinct footprint pointed inward, toward the room, not outward toward the edge. It suggested movement, yes, but movement in the wrong direction. A technician later whispered that the footprint looked fresh, meaning it should have been one of the last marks made before the morning discovery. But if that was true, the timeline shifted again, and not in a comfortable direction. Even stranger was the thin line on the railing, almost invisible unless the morning light hit at the right angle. A faint horizontal streak, too straight and too narrow to be accidental. It didn't match the rope. It didn't match the clothes she wore, and it didn't match anything inside the room. Someone asked if it could have been left by an object. Someone else answered that the height didn't match. So the question became simple. If the scene happened the way officials said it did, where did that mark come from? Neighbors later told investigators something that should have changed the entire direction of the case. They didn't hear anything during the night. Not a shout, not a thud, not even a sudden noise coming from the courtyard or the balcony. The street was calm, the house was quiet, and nothing suggested the kind of movement that would have created the scene discovered in the morning. One neighbor, who lived closest to the mansion, said the silence was unnatural. She described the area as usually filled with small nighttime sounds, doors closing, footsteps on gravel, voices carried by the ocean breeze. But that night, she heard none of it. It was as if the entire property had been muted. Another neighbor recalled seeing lights on inside the mansion late in the evening, but no movement across the windows, no shadows passing by, no silhouettes shifting inside the rooms. Just static, frozen light behind the glass. What troubled investigators, at least the ones willing to question the obvious, was how a scene with ropes, movement, and physical positioning could take place without a single audible sign. Even the courtyard showed no trace of disturbance. The plants weren't bent, the gravel wasn't scattered, and nothing looked moved or brushed aside. For a scene that should have involved motion, everything was strangely untouched. And that's when a troubling idea began circulating among a few of the quieter investigators. Maybe the scene didn't happen during the night at all. Maybe it was arranged after. But of course, no one wrote that in the official notes. As investigators reviewed the early timeline, they expected the pieces to fall into place. Who was awake? Who moved through the house? Who could confirm the smallest detail? Instead, the timeline behaved like a thread that snapped every time someone tried to pull it together. The man who found her said he woke up just before sunrise. But his phone records didn't match that claim. A notification was opened earlier, long before he said he was out of bed. When asked about it, he said he didn't remember opening anything. A simple mistake, maybe. But the timeline was already fragile, and this didn't help. The security cameras around the mansion added another layer of confusion. Half of them weren't working that night. Not because they were broken, but because they had been manually turned off earlier in the evening. No one in the house admitted doing it. No one explained why. And it wasn't mentioned in the official conclusion. Even stranger were the lights. According to neighbors, the lights were on late at night. According to the statement inside the file, they were off. The house's electrical panel showed usage patterns that didn't match either version. It was as if the property had lived two different nights, depending on who was telling the story. The final blow to the timeline came from a message found on a phone belonging to someone inside the mansion. A message sent at a time when, according to the official narrative, everyone was asleep. The content wasn't suspicious on its own, but the timing was. Every version of the night contradicted the others. Every fact depended on who was speaking. And the truth, somewhere in the middle, was getting harder to see. When the preliminary report circulated among the officials that morning, it read as if someone had written it before even stepping inside the house. It was brief, shallow, almost impatient. It acknowledged the scene, listed the basic facts, and then leaned toward a conclusion that felt strangely confident for something filled with unanswered questions. Investigators on site exchanged looks. Some raised their eyebrows, others simply stayed quiet. The wording felt rushed, the type of document written when someone wants the narrative wrapped, not understood. It didn't mention the undisturbed dust on the balcony floor. It didn't note the untouched furniture inside the house. It didn't address the light inconsistencies, the missing camera footage, or the footprints that pointed the wrong direction. A few officers tried to voice concerns. They pointed out that nothing connected the interior of the mansion to what occurred outside. They mentioned the rope knots that looked too precise. They questioned the timeline gaps, but their comments were reduced to small annotations in the margins, notes that wouldn't survive the final version. The most troubling line in the draft wasn't what it said. It was what it didn't say. It didn't ask how such an unusual scene could occur without noise. It didn't question why half the cameras were off. It didn't try to reconcile the conflicting statements. Instead, it leaned on a single idea, that everything could be explained without looking deeper. One investigator later summarized it quietly to a colleague. It feels like they decided the ending before they read the beginning. When the medical team examined her, they expected certain patterns, marks that aligned with the story forming in the official file. But the first thing they noticed was how uneven everything was. Some areas showed pressure that didn't match the angle of the ropes. Others showed no marks where marks should have been if the explanations circulating among the officials were accurate. One examiner quietly questioned the positioning of her hands. The marks didn't match the supposed sequence of movement. The angles were off. The distribution made little sense. It looked less like the result of a single continuous action and more like a combination of separate events, moments that didn't line up with what was being implied. Another detail stood out. Small abrasions in places that didn't fit the narrative. They were too low, too lateral, or appearing where nothing in the environment could reasonably cause them. One technician said the pattern felt interrupted, as if the body had been handled in stages rather than in one flowing moment. Even more troubling were the areas with no marks at all, spots that should have shown clear pressure if the scene had unfolded the way the officials suggested. The absence was as suspicious as the presence. The medical notes weren't dramatic. They weren't emotional. They simply documented inconsistencies, one after another, in calm, clinical lines. But those quiet details carried weight. They hinted at a sequence of events that didn't match the neatly packaged conclusion forming elsewhere. One examiner put it plainly during an unofficial conversation. If this scene happened the way they say, the body would tell a different story. One detail became impossible to ignore: her hands. The positioning alone was unusual, but the condition of the wrists raised even more questions. The bindings were tight, but not in the way you'd expect if someone had tied them under stress. The knots were precise, almost symmetrical, and placed in spots difficult, nearly impossible, for a person to reach on their own. A seasoned investigator examined the photos and paused. He asked a simple question, but one that shifted the entire tone of the room. How could someone tie themselves like this, with this level of accuracy? No one had an answer. The fibers on the rope showed minimal fraying, suggesting controlled handling rather than frantic movement. The spacing between the loops was even, the tension consistent. These were characteristics you'd expect from someone tying another person, not themselves. Then someone noticed something even more striking. There were no clear signs of struggle on her wrists. The marks were present, but they didn't show the erratic pattern that appears when someone fights against restraints. Instead, the pressure looked uniform, as if the bindings had been placed and kept still. A medical specialist later pointed out a subtle detail. The wrists displayed slight differences in coloration, suggesting that they may not have been bound at the exact same time. If that were true, it introduced a sequence of events completely incompatible with the rapid, chaotic scenario described in the preliminary report. One quiet comment circulated among those who saw the full set of photos. The wrists alone contradict the entire story. And once that observation took root, every other detail in the room, the rope, the knots, the balcony, the silence, began to look even more out of place. The forensic team returned to the balcony for a deeper analysis. They expected to find micro-evidence, fibers, prints, small disturbances in the dust, that could tie the interior of the room to the events outside. But what they found was the opposite. The dust patterns on the balcony floor were almost untouched. A thin, natural layer covered the tiles, and except for one partial footprint already documented earlier, there were no signs of movement, no dragging marks, no shifting of weight, no scuffs suggesting a struggle, or even the simplest repositioning. One of the technicians crouched near the railing and examined the base. expecting to find indications of contact, pressure marks, smudges from skin oils, or residue from fabric. He found none. The railing looked aged, but strangely consistent, as if no one had touched it in hours. Then came the most confusing part. The rope that extended from the guest room toward the balcony had fibers that suggested recent tension, but the balcony tiles below it showed no evidence of that tension ever transferring downward. If someone had leaned, pulled, or shifted their weight, the dust should have been disrupted. But it wasn't. It lay in perfect fragile patterns that would have broken with even the smallest movement. One examiner quietly noted a contradiction no one was prepared to address. The rope tells one story, the balcony tells another. Even the air conditioning vents near the balcony door added to the mystery. The airflow should have displaced dust over time, but the particles were settled, undisturbed, suggesting the door had remained closed far longer than the timeline claimed. Every new observation deepened the divide between the physical evidence and the official explanation, and the more they looked, the clearer it became. Wherever the truth was, it wasn't on this balcony. The guest room carried its own set of contradictions, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Investigators scanned the furniture, the bed frame, the dresser, and the carpet, expecting to find signs of movement. But nothing stood out. Everything looked untouched, as if the room had been prepared for a visitor who never arrived. Then they noticed the small table near the window. On top of it sat an object that didn't make sense. A heavy piece of furniture positioned slightly off-center, but with a perfect outline of dust beneath it. That meant one thing. Someone had moved it recently, but carefully enough to return it almost exactly to its original spot. Almost. The shift was small, barely a few centimeters, but nothing else in the room suggested any activity that night, and no explanation inside the preliminary file mentioned anyone entering this room with a reason to move anything at all. One investigator ran his finger across the dust line. It was clean, sharp, and unmistakable. Whatever moved that table did so with intent, not in panic. Further inspection revealed another detail. A small fabric thread caught between the table leg and the floor. It didn't match the bed linens, her clothes, or anything else in the room. A stray thread shouldn't be suspicious, but in a room with no chaos, a thread out of place becomes a question. Why was anything moved if nothing was supposed to have happened here? Why was this room supposedly irrelevant to the main scene, hiding tiny signs of careful adjustment? And then came the question one officer whispered while looking at the diagram of the house. If this room wasn't part of what happened, why does it look like someone prepared it? The guest room wasn't chaotic. It was curated, a controlled silence inside a house where too many details were controlled. The bathroom connected to the guest room was supposed to be irrelevant, a simple side space, untouched, unimportant. But when investigators stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The tiles were cold, the air still, and the lighting cast sharp reflections across the surfaces, revealing details that didn't match anything in the official narrative. The first thing they noticed was the towel bar. It was slightly bent downward, just enough to suggest weight had been applied to it recently. Not enough to break it, just enough to show use. But the bar wasn't designed to support any real pressure. It shouldn't have bent at all. Then came the water. The surface of the sink was wet, not dripping, not splashed, but wiped, as if someone had run their hands under the faucet and then dried them with unusual care. But the towel on the rack was perfectly folded. No signs of moisture, no signs of recent handling. One investigator knelt beside the bathtub and saw something even stranger. Faint streaks on the porcelain. Narrow, parallel, almost invisible unless viewed from the right angle. Not scratches, not dirt. More like the marks left by something smooth being dragged gently along the surface. But the strangest detail was the small residue near the drain. A faint, gray smear, thin and deliberate, as if it came from fabric. Fabric not found anywhere else in the room. For a case described as sudden, chaotic, and isolated, the bathroom looked like a place where someone took their time. A technician whispered what everyone else was thinking. This room looks used, but not by her. And right here, as the contradictions began to stack on top of each other, the the story took its sharpest turn. If you're still here, keep going. What comes next changes everything. Back inside the main room, investigators faced a detail that should have been simple but wasn't: fingerprints. For a house with multiple people staying there, the surfaces were surprisingly clean. Too clean. Smooth areas that should have shown natural smudges, the kind left unconsciously after touching a door, a railing, a drawer, showed almost nothing. The guest room door had only partial prints near the lower section, as if someone had touched it while wearing gloves or using only the very tips of their fingers. The dresser drawers, which should have been magnets for prints, had none that matched her. Not one. Even the light switch, a guaranteed hotspot in any room, carried a single partial print that couldn't be matched with certainty. Then there was the balcony door handle, completely clean. No prints from her. No prints from the man who said he tried to open it. No prints from anyone. Just a smooth surface, untouched, as if it had been wiped carefully sometime during the night. But the official notes made no mention of anyone cleaning or adjusting anything inside the house before the discovery. One investigator pointed to a framed picture on the wall. It was slightly misaligned, tilted just enough to stand out. But the frame's edges had zero prints, zero smudges, zero accidental touches. That kind of precision doesn't happen naturally. Another officer finally asked the question everyone was avoiding. Why does a lived-in house look like no one has lived here? And the deeper they looked, the stranger it became. Not only were key fingerprints missing, but the few that were present didn't tell the story the officials wanted them to tell. The room didn't look disturbed. It looked curated, organized, as if someone had walked through the house, not in panic, but to erase. When the final report was drafted, it moved through the department faster than anyone expected. Pages that should have taken days of analysis were reviewed in hours. Meetings that should have involved multiple specialists were kept small, quiet, and strangely private. Inside one of those meetings, according to someone who later spoke off the record, the tone wasn't analytical, it was administrative. Instead of dissecting evidence, they discussed closure, public clarity, and the need for a narrative that would settle the community. The conversation shifted from what the evidence suggested to what the conclusion needed to be. One officer asked about the missing prints. The response was that prints aren't always reliable. Another asked about the untouched dust on the balcony. The answer was that dust shouldn't be overinterpreted. A third mentioned the rope fibers and the inconsistent marks on the wrists. He was told the findings were within expected variation. But the strangest part wasn't the answers. It was how quickly the questions stopped. The report brushed past the contradicting timelines, the malfunctioning cameras, the strange marks in the bathroom, and the knots that experts quietly questioned. Instead, it leaned heavily on broad statements, phrases that sounded official but explained nothing. One investigator described the meeting this way: "It wasn't about evidence, it was about moving forward." When the final version of the report was released, it read like a story that had cut the middle chapters to save time. The beginning was incomplete. The ending was confident. Everything in between had been smoothed over. And the most telling detail? Several of the inconsistencies documented in early notes simply vanished. Not addressed, not clarified, just gone. For some, that was the moment they realized the truth. The report wasn't answering questions. It was avoiding them. After the report was released, a small group of independent analysts began reviewing the evidence with fresh eyes. They didn't have the pressure of deadlines, internal politics, or departmental expectations. They looked only at the facts that suddenly formed a pattern the official conclusion refused to acknowledge. The first question was simple. Why were there no clear footprints on the balcony except for one print pointing in the wrong direction? The second question followed naturally. How could the rope show recent tension while the dust beneath it remained untouched? Then came the third question, one that still circulates among forensic experts today. Why were the bindings so precise, symmetrical, and clean, yet the medical markings didn't support the sequence implied by the setup? None of these questions were addressed in the report, not even briefly. Then analysts turned to the timeline, the phone data, the messages sent at impossible hours. The notifications opened when people claimed to be asleep, The lights that were on when they were supposed to be off. The cameras manually disabled. Each inconsistency by itself could have been dismissed. But together, they formed something undeniable. A night that didn't match the story told about it. One analyst summarized it this way: every unexplained detail points to preparation, not reaction. And the closer they looked, the stranger it became. There were objects moved without explanation. Rooms that looked arranged rather than used. Surfaces wiped clean at times when no one admitted being awake. Evidence that contradicted the very foundation of the official version. But the most haunting part wasn't what they found. It was what they realized they would never know. Some pieces were missing. Some data was incomplete. Some logs were overwritten. Not because of time, but because someone made decisions early. That shaped everything that came after. When all the evidence was placed side by side, photos, timelines, reports, statements, and the fragments that slipped through the cracks, a different picture emerged. Not a clear one, not a simple one, but a picture impossible to reconcile with the official version. The interior of the mansion looked staged, as if someone had moved through the rooms with careful intent. Too few prints, too many surfaces wiped. Objects shifted just enough to matter, but not enough to look obvious. A house full of signs that didn't reflect a chaotic night, but a curated one. Then there was the balcony, silent, untouched, and inconsistent with every movement required by the narrative. Dust patterns that didn't break, a railing that didn't show contact, footprints pointing inward, not outward, a space that contradicted the explanation from the ground up. Inside, the bindings told another story. The knots were deliberate, measured, methodical, nothing like something done in panic, fear, or haste. And the marks on her wrists refused to line up with the supposed sequence of events. Taken alone, each inconsistency could be debated. Together, they formed a structure that pointed toward preparation, planning, and hands that did not belong to her. Independent analysts, retired investigators, and specialists eventually reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. The scene did not behave like a spontaneous moment. It behaved like something assembled, something arranged, something built piece by piece. But that realization created a new problem. A problem that still stands today. If the scene was arranged, who arranged it? And why did the final report move so quickly to dismiss every contradiction that should have halted the entire process? These are the questions that transformed a tragic moment into one of the most debated cases in modern American history. Questions that remain open. Questions that refuse to fade. In the years that followed, experts revisited the photographs, the reports, the timelines, and every scrap of evidence that survived the early decisions made inside that mansion. And each time they arrived at the same conclusion. The scene didn't line up with the explanation. Not then, not now. The silence around the case only deepened the questions. Why were certain details ignored while others were overstated? Why were key inconsistencies brushed aside? And how did a scene with so many contradictions reach such an absolute conclusion so quickly? Families who experience tragedy often seek clarity. But in this case, clarity was replaced with a verdict that closed more doors than it opened. Answers were promised, but never delivered. Evidence was collected, but never fully explored. And the voices that tried to point toward the gaps were softened, then silenced. Independent investigators, journalists, and forensic specialists would spend years trying to reconstruct what happened inside that mansion. They didn't agree on every detail, but they agreed on one thing: the truth was never fully pursued. The house has changed since then. New owners, new walls, new silence. But the story refuses to stay inside its boundaries. It resurfaces every time someone looks at the photos and realizes how little in that scene matches the explanation written on the final page of the report. Today, the case stands as a reminder of something uncomfortable. Not every file tells the truth. Not every conclusion brings closure. And sometimes the story written on paper is the one that least resembles what happened in reality. Maybe one day someone will step forward with a missing piece. Maybe someone already knows it, or maybe the truth is still sitting inside that mansion, hidden in the quiet details no one was willing to examine. But until that happens, one thing remains certain. Nothing in the scene matches the file. Nothing ever did.
If something about this story stayed with you, the playlist that appeared will take you deeper. Tap it and keep going.